It's August 13th, 2026, and a story that first surfaced back in the spring is suddenly looking a lot less hypothetical and a lot more urgent. Because the Pentagon's plan for what officials are internally calling a final blow against Iran hasn't gone away, it's been sitting ready this entire time, and the conditions that would actually trigger it are lining up right now in a way that should genuinely worry anyone paying attention. Reporting First revealed months ago that American military planners had developed 4 distinct options for a decisive, war-ending campaign against Iran. Everything from seizing key islands in the Strait of Hormuz to a massive combined ground and air operation targeting what remains of Iran's nuclear program. At the time, officials described these as hypothetical scenarios, contingency plans sitting in a drawer in case diplomacy completely failed. Diplomacy has now completely failed, at least for the moment, and there's a detail buried in recent Pentagon disclosures that makes this entire plan far more dangerous than most people currently understand, because the American military isn't approaching this potential final blow from a position of overwhelming strength. It's approaching it after burning through a staggering percentage of its own missile defense stockpiles, a reality that changes everything about how risky any of these 4 options would actually be if Washington decided to pull the trigger. And that's exactly the part of this story that almost nobody outside a handful of defense reporters has actually connected together yet. Let's walk through exactly what these 4 options actually are, because the details matter enormously for understanding just how consequential any of them would be. According to reporting based on conversations with multiple officials and sources familiar with the internal planning process, the first option on the table involves invading or blockading Kharg Island, the hub that handles the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil export capacity, effectively severing the country's last significant economic lifeline in a single decisive move. The second option involves invading Larak, a smaller island that Iran has used to help control and monitor the Strait of Hormuz, home to bunkers, fast attack craft capable of striking cargo ships, and radar systems that track everything moving through the waterway. The third option involves seizing Abu Musa along with 2 smaller nearby islands, territory Iran controls, but that the United Arab Emirates has claimed for decades, a move that would carry enormous diplomatic complexity given the UAE's own stake in that territorial dispute. And the fourth option involves directly blocking or seizing vessels, attempting to export Iranian oil from the eastern side of the strait, essentially formalizing and expanding the kind of interdiction operations that have already been happening throughout this war into something considerably more aggressive and more permanent. It's worth appreciating just how differently these 4 options are structured strategically, because they don't all represent the same category of escalation, even though they get grouped together under the same final blow label. 2 of them, the Kharg Island option and the oil export interdiction option, are fundamentally economic in nature, aimed at completing the financial strangulation of the regime that the naval blockade has already been working toward for months, just through more direct occupation-based means rather than the standoff enforcement that's characterized the war so far. The other 2, Larak and Abu Musa, are fundamentally about physical control of territory and military infrastructure, aimed at permanently eliminating Iran's ability to threaten the strait from specific, identified strongpoints, rather than simply degrading that capability through repeated airstrikes the way this war has largely operated up until now. That distinction matters because it tells you these aren't 4 versions of the same basic operation. They're 4 genuinely different theories of how you actually force an end to this conflict, squeeze the money, or seize the territory. And officials reportedly haven't settled on which theory they actually believe is more likely to work. Layered on top of those 4 maritime and economic options, planners have also reportedly developed 2 separate approaches, specifically for Iran's remaining nuclear infrastructure, one involving actual ground operations to physically secure or seize enriched uranium stockpiles at Iranian facilities, and an alternative that would avoid putting American boots on Iranian soil entirely in favor of another large-scale air campaign. The fact that ground operations to physically secure nuclear material are even on the table tells you how seriously officials have come to doubt whether airstrikes alone, no matter how many bunker busters get dropped on facilities like Fordow or Pickaxe Mountain, can actually guarantee that Iran's enriched uranium stockpile has been fully accounted for and neutralized. That's an extraordinary admission buried inside these plans, because sending American troops onto the ground inside Iran specifically to secure nuclear material represents a fundamentally different order of risk and commitment than anything this war has involved up to this point. Think about what a ground operation like that would actually require in practice, because it's a genuinely different category of military commitment than anything else in this entire war. You're not talking about a raid that lands, secures a target, and withdraws within hours. You're talking about troops potentially needing to hold ground long enough to properly assess, catalog, and remove or destroy nuclear material in a way that satisfies international verification standards. all while operating deep inside hostile territory with a fractured but still functional Iranian security apparatus capable of mounting a defense. That kind of sustained ground presence creates exactly the kind of vulnerability to ambush, to improvised explosive devices, and to the mass casualty events that air power-focused operations have largely allowed American forces to avoid throughout this entire conflict so far. It's precisely why the air campaign alternative exists as a parallel option, a recognition that even with all the uncertainty surrounding whether repeated bombing can truly destroy deeply buried nuclear infrastructure, the alternative of actually sending troops onto the ground carries a level of risk that planners clearly view as a last resort rather than a first choice. Before we get into why the timing of all this matters so much right now, and why the actual condition of America's own military stockpiles makes this entire plan considerably more dangerous than the confident language coming out of the Pentagon might suggest, if you're finding this breakdown useful in understanding what's honestly one of the more alarming threads running underneath this entire war, take a second to drop a comment with your thoughts. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more to unpack here. Let's rewind and talk about how we got to a point where plans this dramatic were even being drawn up in the first place. This war began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise strike that killed Iran's supreme leader along with dozens of senior commanders in a single devastating night. Iran's response was to weaponize the Strait of Hormuz, and the following months turned into exactly the grinding, cyclical conflict we've tracked throughout this entire war. Ceasefires negotiated and broken, a naval blockade that gutted Iran's oil exports, repeated near breakthroughs in diplomacy that collapsed within days every single time. That 6-month arc is worth laying out in full, because it's exactly what makes these contingency plans feel less like abstract military theory and more like the logical next step in an exhausted, repeating cycle. Early ceasefires brokered by regional mediators held for weeks before collapsing over disputed shipping routes. A naval blockade choked off Iran's oil exports to near zero for stretches of the war, only for exports to partially recover whenever enforcement briefly eased. Diplomatic frameworks over the Strait of Hormuz got described as nearly finalized on multiple separate occasions, only to fall apart within days after a fresh attack on a tanker or a fresh round of hardline rhetoric out of Tehran. Every single one of those cycles has left both sides a little more exhausted, a little more distrustful, and a little closer to concluding that the current approach, gradual pressure paired with periodic diplomacy, simply isn't going to produce a durable resolution on its own, which is exactly the environment in which contingency plans built around a single, decisive final blow start to look increasingly attractive, regardless of the risk involved. By late March, barely a month into the fighting, officials were already describing a dramatic military escalation as more likely if diplomacy failed to make progress and the strait remained closed, framing a crushing, decisive show of force as something that could either force a genuine end to the conflict or simply give the American president something dramatic to point to and declare victory over, even if the underlying situation on the ground remained messier than any single dramatic operation could actually resolve. What's happened in the months since that initial reporting is exactly the kind of slow, grinding deterioration that makes contingency plans like this stop looking hypothetical and start looking like the most realistic path forward. Just days before this current moment, Iran's supreme leader replaced his national security chief, installing a Revolutionary Guard stalwart in the role specifically responsible for handling this crisis. A clear signal that hardliners, rather than diplomats, currently hold the upper hand inside Tehran's own decision-making structure. A shift that mirrors almost exactly the same pattern of hardline consolidation this war has produced every single time diplomacy has appeared to stall out. Iran's foreign minister has publicly stated the country isn't engaged in any negotiations with Washington at all, and has said Tehran won't negotiate unless the United States first honors commitments from an earlier interim agreement signed back in June, an agreement that collapsed almost as soon as it was signed. President Trump, for his part, has shifted his own public tone considerably, describing the administration as low-keying negotiations for now and putting more emphasis instead on increasing economic pressure, telling interviewers that Iran is in very bad shape economically and doesn't have the money to pay its own soldiers. That combination, a stalled diplomatic track on one side and a president publicly signaling patience for economic strangulation rather than urgency for a deal on the other, is precisely the kind of environment where a contingency plan like this final blow scenario stops sitting quietly in a drawer and starts becoming an active live option. I want to pause here for a second, because if this level of detail about how these contingency plans actually connect to the broader diplomatic collapse is helping you understand why this war keeps escalating despite months of supposed progress, that's exactly the kind of context that gets lost in day-to-day headlines. So drop a comment with what you want to see covered next, and share this with anyone in your circle who's been trying to follow where this war might actually be headed. Let's talk about why each of these four options carries such enormous risk and complexity. Because none of them are simple, clean operations, regardless of how confidently they might get described in a planning document. And understanding that complexity is essential to seeing why officials themselves keep hedging on which option, if any, they'd actually choose to pursue when the moment finally comes. Invading or blockading Kharg Island means directly attacking the single most important piece of economic infrastructure, keeping Iran's government solvent at all, the facility responsible for handling the overwhelming majority of the country's remaining oil exports. That's not a symbolic target, it's an attack on the literal financial lifeline of the regime, and seizing or blockading it outright would represent an enormous escalation beyond the naval blockade of ports that's already been running for months, moving from restricting Iran's ability to move oil to physically occupying or destroying the infrastructure that makes moving that oil possible in the first place. Invading Larak carries a different but equally serious set of risks, because that island isn't just an economic target, it's a genuine military strongpoint, housing bunkers, fast attack craft specifically designed to threaten commercial shipping, and radar systems that give Iran real-time visibility over everything moving through the strait. Taking that island by force means fighting through prepared defensive positions in a confined, dangerous stretch of water, exactly the kind of operation that risks American casualties in a way that months of standoff airstrikes and naval interdiction have largely managed to avoid up until now. Unlike a strike from the air, an amphibious or airborne assault on a defended island means American service members physically stepping onto contested ground, engaging entrenched defenders at close range, and holding that position long enough to actually secure it. A fundamentally different and fundamentally riskier proposition than anything the maritime blockade or the air campaign has required of American forces so far. Seizing Abu Musa and its two smaller neighboring islands introduces an entirely separate layer of complexity, because unlike Kharg or Larak, this specific territory is the subject of a genuine, decades-old international dispute, claimed by both Iran and the United Arab Emirates. American forces seizing that territory, even in the context of a war against Iran specifically, would immediately raise uncomfortable questions about what happens to that territory afterward, whether it gets handed to the UAE, whether it becomes some kind of internationally administered zone, or whether the United States simply ends up occupying disputed territory indefinitely. None of which are simple outcomes to manage diplomatically, even setting aside the military risk of the operation itself. Every regional partner watching this war closely, and there are many, would be forced to take a position on that territorial question the moment American troops actually landed there, turning a purely military operation into an immediate diplomatic minefield involving at least one close American ally with its own long-standing claim to the exact same islands, and blocking or seizing vessels exporting Iranian oil from the eastern side of the strait, while perhaps the least dramatic sounding of the four options, actually represents a significant expansion of exactly the kind of maritime interdiction that's already been running throughout this war, just formalized and pushed considerably further, essentially declaring open economic warfare against any vessel attempting to move Iranian crude, regardless of flag or origin, a move that risks drawing in third-party countries and shipping companies who have so far managed to stay on the margins of this conflict, turning what has largely been a two-sided fight into something with far more international exposure than either side has had to manage up until now. Let's talk about the detail that genuinely changes how you should think about the risk profile of all four of these options, because this is where the story gets considerably more alarming than the confident language surrounding these plans might initially suggest, and it's the piece almost none of the public conversation around this war has fully connected yet. According to recent disclosures from sources familiar with the Pentagon's internal assessments, the American military has burned through nearly 80% of its interceptors for a key missile defense system over the course of this war, leaving commanders describing the broader munitions stockpile as dangerously low. That's an extraordinary admission, and it's precisely the kind of detail that rarely makes it into the confident, decisive framing that surrounds discussions of a final blow campaign. Air defense interceptors aren't something you can simply manufacture overnight. They require specialized production lines, rare components, and months of manufacturing lead time even under the most urgent wartime priority, which is exactly why the Pentagon has reportedly been asking major American defense contractors to significantly ramp up production, specifically because existing stockpiles have been depleted faster than anyone anticipated when this war began. It's worth understanding just how consequential a shortage like this actually is for the broader defensive umbrella protecting American forces and regional allies throughout this entire conflict. These interceptor systems represent the primary line of defense against exactly the kind of ballistic missile and drone threats Iran has repeatedly demonstrated it retains the capability to launch, even after 5 months of sustained strikes against its missile production infrastructure and storage facilities. A depleted interceptor stockpile doesn't just mean fewer defensive options in a future crisis. It means that the margin for error protecting American bases, allied cities, and commercial shipping throughout the region has been narrowing steadily over the course of this war, even as the underlying Iranian missile threat, degraded but nowhere near eliminated according to every serious intelligence assessment, remains capable of testing that margin at a moment's notice. That's precisely the kind of vulnerability that rarely factors into public discussions of bold military options, because acknowledging it means admitting that the defensive infrastructure underpinning American strategy in this war has been quietly eroding for months, even while the offensive side of the campaign generates the vast majority of the dramatic headlines and footage. Think about what that shortage actually means for any of these 4 escalation options specifically. Every single one of them, invading islands, seizing oil tankers, expanding ground operations against nuclear facilities, would almost certainly provoke exactly the kind of retaliatory missile and drone barrage from Iran that American forces have spent this entire war intercepting, using the very air defense systems that are now reportedly running critically low on interceptors. If the United States launches a final blow operation and Iran responds with a serious wave of ballistic missiles or drones aimed at American bases, ships, or regional allies, the systems responsible for shooting those threats down may simply not have the interceptor stockpile available to handle a sustained, high-intensity exchange the way they've been able to throughout the earlier phases of this war. That's not a minor logistical footnote. That's potentially the difference between American forces successfully defending against Iranian retaliation and American forces, or American allies, actually absorbing hits that a fully stocked missile defense network would have been able to prevent. This is exactly why the framing of these plans as simply hypothetical, sitting quietly in reserve until diplomacy fails, undersells just how much more dangerous executing any of them has become since they were first drafted back in the spring. When these options were originally developed, American forces presumably had considerably deeper reserves of the interceptors and munitions needed to absorb whatever retaliation Iran might launch in response to a dramatic escalation like seizing an island or blockading Kharg. Months of sustained combat operations later, that cushion has eroded dramatically, which means the exact same military options that looked merely aggressive back in March now carry a meaningfully higher risk of American casualties or successful Iranian strikes against regional targets, precisely because the defensive infrastructure meant to absorb Iran's response has been worn down by everything that's already happened in this war up to this point. There's also a broader strategic tension worth understanding here, because officials themselves have reportedly acknowledged that Iran has a say in how any of these scenarios actually plays out, and that many of the options under discussion risk prolonging and intensifying the fighting rather than bringing it to the kind of dramatic, decisive conclusion planners might hope for. That's an important caveat buried inside the reporting on these plans, an acknowledgement from inside the planning process itself that a final blow, however impressive it might look executed on paper or in a single night of dramatic footage, doesn't automatically translate into Iran actually surrendering or the war actually ending, a lesson this conflict has already taught in nearly every other domain it's touched over the past 6 months. Given everything this conflict has demonstrated about Iran's willingness to absorb enormous punishment while continuing to resist, from a decapitated leadership structure to a collapsed economy to months of sustained naval blockade, there's a real possibility that even a dramatic final blow operation simply becomes the opening chapter of an even longer, even more costly phase of this war, rather than the conclusion officials are hoping it might deliver. Let's widen the lens for a moment and look at the broader international context this planning is unfolding in, because the rest of the world isn't simply waiting passively to see what Washington decides. China has publicly urged all parties to prioritize peace talks and seize what officials described as the opportunity for peace, language that reflects Beijing's own significant economic interest in seeing Iranian oil exports, so much of which flow toward Chinese refineries, resume without further disruption. Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey have reportedly been working together to try to organize renewed talks between Washington and Tehran. Those sources involved in those mediation efforts have been candid about the core obstacle, describing mistrust between the two sides as the fundamental problem undermining every attempt at a durable settlement so far. Qatar's foreign ministry has separately described efforts to resolve the conflict as being in very progressive stages, with drafts of a potential agreement reportedly being circulated even without formal direct talks taking place, a pattern of indirect, mediator-driven diplomacy that's characterized much of this war's more promising moments, even when those moments have repeatedly failed to produce a lasting resolution. It's worth appreciating just how many separate countries now have a direct diplomatic stake in seeing this war end, because that itself tells you something about how far this conflict's consequences have spread beyond the two primary combatants. China's economic exposure through Iranian oil purchases, Pakistan and Turkey's regional security interests, Qatar's role as a trusted intermediary with relationships on both sides, Egypt's own historical ties to mediation efforts throughout the broader Middle East, Every one of these countries has reasons that have nothing to do with sympathy for either Washington or Tehran specifically, and everything to do with protecting their own economic and security interests from a conflict that keeps threatening to spill over into global energy markets and regional stability more broadly. That breadth of outside involvement is exactly why so many of this war's ceasefires and near breakthroughs have come through third-party mediation rather than direct American and Iranian negotiation, because neither side currently trusts the other enough to negotiate without an intermediary bridging the gap, and increasingly, it's not just one intermediary, but several working in parallel, each bringing their own leverage and their own motivations to the table. There's also a revealing detail about how this war has started reshaping American alliances well beyond the Middle East itself, one that speaks to just how much strategic bandwidth this conflict is consuming. Reports have emerged of alarm in Seoul over direction from the American president to substantially reduce joint military exercises with South Korean forces, a decision explicitly tied to the ongoing war with Iran, with the president reportedly framing the reduction around South Korea's unwillingness to join efforts specifically aimed at denuclearizing Iran. That's a genuinely significant development, a 7-decade-old alliance relationship being visibly strained specifically because of how much this Iran conflict is consuming American attention, resources, and political capital, a sign that the costs of this war are rippling out into corners of American foreign policy that have nothing directly to do with the Gulf at all. Think about what that specific strain actually reveals about the broader strategic bandwidth problem this war has created. Maintaining a credible deterrent posture on the Korean Peninsula, sustaining a massive, multi-front military commitment across the Gulf, and simultaneously managing global adversaries like Russia and China, who are watching every ounce of American attention get consumed by a single regional conflict. These are not separate, unrelated challenges. They draw from the exact same finite pool of military assets, political attention, and diplomatic capital. When an alliance as long-standing and as strategically important as the one with South Korea starts showing visible strain, specifically because of resource allocation tied to the Iran war, that's a strong signal that whatever bandwidth existed for balancing multiple global commitments simultaneously is running thinner than officials have generally acknowledged in public, precisely the same kind of quiet, underappreciated strain that's also produced. The depleted interceptor stockpiles sitting behind these 4 final blow options. Let's talk honestly about what all of this actually means for whether a final blow scenario becomes reality, because there's a genuine range of outcomes worth considering rather than assuming escalation is inevitable just because the plans exist. The first possibility is that the current economic pressure campaign, the naval blockade, the collapsed oil exports, the currency crisis, the inflation running near 70%, eventually succeeds in forcing Iran back to a genuine negotiating table before any of these 4 dramatic options ever needs to be exercised. Trump's own recent comments describing Iran as being in very bad shape economically and low-keying negotiations in favor of continued economic pressure suggest that, at least for the moment, the administration may be betting that patience and continued strangulation will accomplish what a risky final blow operation might not reliably achieve, especially given how depleted American munitions stockpiles have reportedly become. The second possibility is that the diplomatic freeze, reinforced by Iran's own hardline leadership reshuffle and its public insistence that no negotiations are even happening, drags on long enough, or Iran launches a provocation serious enough, that Washington concludes economic pressure alone genuinely isn't going to produce a resolution within any reasonable time frame, and decides to execute one or more of these final blow options despite the elevated risk created by depleted interceptor stockpiles, betting that the shock value of a decisive move outweighs the vulnerability it temporarily creates. If that happens, you should expect a level of escalation and a level of risk to American forces considerably higher than anything this war has produced so far, precisely because the defensive cushion that's protected American forces and regional allies throughout the earlier phases of this conflict has been worn down by months of sustained combat operations. The third possibility, and probably the most likely given the pattern this war has followed for nearly 6 months now, is that these plans continue sitting exactly where they've sat since March, ready but unexecuted, functioning more as a form of psychological pressure and strategic signaling than as an actual operational blueprint anyone genuinely intends to follow through on in the immediate future. While the grinding economic and diplomatic war of attrition that's actually defined this conflict continues in the background, occasionally punctuated by exactly the kind of individual escalations, island strikes, tanker attacks, nuclear facility bombings, that have characterized nearly every month of this war without any of them actually constituting the kind of decisive final blow these formal contingency plans describe. What's clear, no matter which of these paths plays out, is that the existence of these plans and the specific detail about how depleted America's own missile defense stockpiles have become over the course of this war, together, paint a considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous picture than the confident language of a final blow typically suggests. This isn't a military approaching a decisive knockout strike from an unlimited position of strength. It's a military that has already expended an enormous share of its own defensive capability over nearly 6 months of sustained combat, now weighing whether to escalate even further into operations that would almost certainly provoke exactly the kind of retaliatory barrage those depleted defenses were specifically designed to intercept. That gap between the dramatic, decisive framing of these plans and the considerably more constrained reality of what actually backs them up is exactly the kind of detail that tends to get lost in headlines focused purely on the boldness of the options themselves, rather than the condition of the forces that would actually have to execute and defend against the consequences of choosing them. There's a broader lesson worth sitting with here about how wars actually get decided at the level of logistics and industrial capacity, rather than pure strategy or willpower alone. A final blow, however cleverly designed on paper, is only as safe to execute as the defensive infrastructure standing behind it. And that infrastructure, in this specific case, has been quietly wearing thin for months, while the public conversation around this war has stayed focused almost entirely on offensive capability, strike footage, and battlefield outcomes, rather than the far less cinematic question of whether the defensive systems meant to catch whatever comes back in response can actually still do their job. The real story sitting underneath these 4 dramatic options isn't really about islands or oil terminals at all. It's about whether the United States can actually afford, in the most literal industrial and logistical sense, to absorb whatever comes next if Iran decides to fight back hard against whichever option eventually gets chosen. So that's where things stand right now. 4 dramatic escalation options sitting ready inside the Pentagon since the spring, a diplomatic track that's gone essentially frozen just as those options start looking less hypothetical, and a military stockpile situation considerably more strained than the confident talk of a final blow typically lets on. 6 months into this war, the pattern keeps repeating itself. Dramatic capability paired with quietly eroding reserves, bold public rhetoric paired with private acknowledgments that any of these paths could just as easily prolong the fighting as end it. I want to know what you think. Do you believe economic pressure alone eventually forces Iran back to the table before any of these options get used? Or do you think the combination of stalled diplomacy and Iran's own hardline turn makes one of these scenarios increasingly likely, regardless of the risk involved? Let me know in the comments. Share this with anyone who's been trying to understand where this war might actually be headed next. And make sure you're subscribed because there's a lot more developing on this front. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.